Well, welcome to Plato's Pod, where we engage in a group discussion on selections from the complete works of Plato, the philosopher and geometer who wrote nearly 2,400 years ago. Today is June 26, 2023, and I'm your host, James Myers. It's an honor to welcome in discussion members of the Toronto, Calgary, and Chicago Philosophy Meetup groups. Whether you have been with us before or are here for the first time, whether you have experience with or are new to Plato's works, I encourage you to add your voice to our dialogue. To contribute your thoughts, please use the raise hands feature in Zoom. To keep the discussion flowing and ensure everyone has a chance to speak, I'll call on you in the order that hands are raised, using first name only. I've suggested 3 themes and excerpts from today's reading of Plato's short dialogue, the Crito, and these are posted on the shared drive linked to the event notice on meetup.com. We can focus on these or any of the other themes, and for everyone's benefit, please relate your comments and opinions to Plato's text. As we exchange thoughts on today's reading, I'll briefly summarize and try to connect different perspectives to a common thread. After we finish recording in 2 hours, I welcome anyone who wishes to remain online for Plato's Cafe, a casual half-hour discussion on Plato or philosophy in general. So today we end season 3 of our regularly scheduled group discussions with the Crito, in which the title character enters the prison cell, delivering to Socrates the news that his execution will occur the following day. Having been condemned to death by an Athenian jury for corrupting the city's youth with his questions, but quite unconcerned for the short time that remains in his life, Socrates responds that a dream told him his death would occur, in fact, 2 days hence. Like many of Socrates' friends overcome by grief that the philosopher's life is about to be cut short, Crito attempts to persuade Socrates to escape the prison, flee Athens, and take up residence in Thessaly. Crito explains that Socrates' physical safety could be easily secured by bribing the prison officials, a price which Crito and others are willing and able to pay. Socrates, however, will have none of it and accepts the justice of his impending death, even though justice was not present in either his trial or his death sentence. Knowing that Socrates has no concern for his own death, Crito tries to justify escape by explaining the shame that will befall Socrates' friends for having failed to secure his freedom, and by stirring a sense of guilt for leaving his children behind as orphans. The majority of Athenians will not look kindly on those who fail to help their friends, Crito states, to which Socrates replies that the majority opinion is not worth much if it is uninformed and fails to account for what is good. Socrates goes on to explain, as he often does, that the soul is more valuable than the body, and proceeds to answer each one of Crito's points by staging a mock discussion with the laws. As he relates his discussion with the laws, Socrates brings to mind the idea of a social contract or social bargain. Socrates intends to adhere to his part of the bargain, having benefited from all that he received while he freely chose to stay in Athens. The laws, in Socrates' telling, aren't specific to that particular time, but more generally apply to the social constitution that has arisen throughout time. The laws, and therefore the social constitution, are harmed when any one person takes the question of justice into his own hands. It's not the laws in general which have done injustice to Socrates, but the men who apply the laws, a point that Socrates makes at the end of the dialogue at 54c. I'll begin today's discussion with a brief reading from 44b to 44d, in which Crito presents the subject of the majority opinion. I thought it worth mentioning on the cover page of today's notes the meaning of opinion as Socrates explained it in the Republic in the discussion of the divided line of knowledge. In those passages from 509d to 511b of the Republic, Socrates presented knowledge as a continuum in which the soul gauges the value of information in stages, beginning with belief, next proceeding to opinion, then to knowledge, and finally to wisdom. So let's hear what Socrates has to say then about the opinion of the majority, beginning at 44b. I'll just take a brief moment here to do a screen share. Maybe I'll just read this section. There's just 2 parts for each of Crito and Socrates, but if we want to have volunteer readers in the next sections, be happy to take volunteers for those. But I'll just read this. This is a short one. So this is from 44b to 44d. Crito starts, "Too clear it seems to me, my dear Socrates, but listen to me even now and be saved. If you die, it will not be a single misfortune for me. Not only will I be deprived of a friend the like of whom I shall never find again, but many people who do not know you or me very well will think that I could have saved you if I were willing to spend money, but that I did not care to do so. Surely there can be no worse reputation than to be thought to value money more highly than one's friends, for the majority will not believe that you yourself were not willing to leave prison while we were eager for you to do so." Socrates replies, "My good Crito, why should we care so much for what the majority think? The most reasonable people, to whom one should pay more attention, will believe that things were done as they were done. Crito replies, "You see, Socrates, that one must also pay attention to the opinion of the majority. Your present situation makes clear that the majority can inflict not the least, but pretty well the greatest evils if one is slandered among them." Socrates says, "Would that the majority could inflict the greatest evils, for they would then be capable of the greatest good, and that would be fine, but now they cannot do either. They cannot make a man either wise or foolish, but they inflict things haphazardly." So I just wanted to start with that section, and I would put a footnote here. Darren was kind enough to present an alternative translation of those last two sentences of Socrates. It's a little bit different. And in this alternative translation from the Oxford University Press 1999 edition, the translation is, Crito, if only the populace could inflict the worst of evils, then they would also be capable of providing the greatest of goods, and a fine thing that would be. But the fact is that they can do neither. They are unable to give anyone understanding or lack of it, no matter what they do. So I wanted to start with this and maybe to see where we go with this, wondering particularly about that statement that Socrates makes at the end of what I just read, that if the majority could inflict the greatest of evils, they could also do the greatest of good. And then that idea that is that opposite present in everybody. Does that make sense, what he's saying? We can consider as well in the next section the arguments that Crito continues to employ to try to convince Socrates to escape. And so what do we think of this idea of the greatest evils and the greatest good? Is that present in all people? Dave, your thoughts?
Personally, I don't think so. I think some people can embody, as great an evil as you can get in humans. And similarly, other people may embody the greatest good that you can find in humans. And it's not necessarily true that the same people, if they have one, they can also have the other. I think Socrates is wrong. I mean, you may be able to find, well, I just think his psychology is incorrect, that generally speaking, people in which you can find the worst are not going to be the ones you can also find the best. So I disagree with him.
How about the idea of the majority, in the sense that if an individual is capable of neither the greatest good or the greatest evil, what is he saying about the majority here? Does the majority somehow come together and determine the greatest evil and the greatest good?
No, I think in a group setting, you get more of a moderation. So it would be amazing if you got a group of people that are really good, so that group can, as a group, form really good opinions or laws or something. But then the same group, I think, would be incapable of being really bad. So again, I don't think the fact that there's a large number of people would actually help the extremes, which Socrates seems to be talking about. I think actually it would work against it. Generally speaking, if you got a group of people, a lot of the extremes balance out, and you tend to get a more centralist opinion, would be my argument.
Interesting. Yeah. So the idea that there's potentially moderation in the majority, I think that's an interesting opinion. Let's see where we go with that. And so thanks for that, Dave. And we'll go to Chris. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you. Yeah, I think this statement from Socrates is not even a philosophical statement. It's a factual, mathematical statement, in that when we think about outcomes as humans, we always think of outcome as binary, right? Good or evil, one or zero, where in actuality, all outcomes is a distribution curve, right? So it goes from the most likely to the most unlikely, from left to right or up and down. And the fact that you can make a statement that, one, every person has the potential to do good or evil, right? It depends on whatever your definition of good or evil is unchallenged, right? The potential is equal, right? The only way you can say that's not the case is you take away the person's agency. So if you believe the person has no agency, then yes, then it's possible what Dave says correct, right? The person can do more good or do more evil because he or she had no agency, is being told what to do. But if you believe everybody do have agency, we assume that's the case, then I think the potential to do either way is equal. And the more people that you have, obviously, the more potential you have, right? This is a mathematical and logical deduction. So yes, I think that statement to me is pretty uncontroversial.
Thank you, Chris. And yeah, the idea of agency is an interesting one there. And I guess maybe what effect does the majority have on individual agency? So that's something that we can explore as well. Darren, your thoughts?
So on this question of being able to inflict the greatest of good, if you can inflict the greatest of evils, I think it does matter a bit that we're talking not about an individual here in this passage, but about the group or the majority or like some kind of group dynamic, as James pointed out earlier. But the aspect I want to focus on is a bit different. So he says in the Oxford translation, but the fact is that they can do neither. They are unable to give anyone understanding or lack of it, no matter what they do. And then in the Hackett translation, it says they cannot make a man either wise or foolish, but they inflict things haphazardly. So, like, to me, I think it's significant that the greatest good and the greatest evil that can be done is not about the body. So if it was about the body, I would agree with like what Dave said and maybe what Bentley was suggesting. Because yeah, the there could be majority could, as we've seen in history, decide very evil things that can do things to people's bodies, like concentration camps and mass exterminations. But I think what the passage I think clearly is referring to by the end is that Socrates is talking about our soul. That's what he's going to talk more about. So it's what other people, and in this case, the majority, can do to our soul, whether it has anything to say to that, or whether it can affect anything about it, or whether the soul is something of our own responsibility. I mean, if the majority were able to inflict the worst evil on our soul, on us, which is on our soul, in Plato's and Socrates' view, because that's more important than the body, to live a good life. The important thing is not living a life, as Socrates is going to say in some place in his dialogue, I don't remember where, but to live a good life. So if the majority were able to inflict the greatest of evils, in a way, it would make sense that they could also give us the greatest of good regarding the soul. Because if you're able to affect the soul, you must be an assembly of gods or something. And I don't know if even the god, even in Socrates and Plato's view, would be able to affect our souls. Let's say hypothetically, if such a collection of beings were able to, they must be gods. So if they could do that to our souls, then they must be able to do the greatest things because they're gods. So anyway, I think there is something that makes sense about what is being said here. And I think I'm just trying to bring out, I think, what the underlying implication is. It's about the soul and what can actually affect the soul.
And thanks for bringing up the soul, which, clearly does permeate this dialogue. And you'd mentioned the good. So we will get to the part where Socrates talks about the good. And that's certainly a key element of this dialogue. So yeah, thanks for those. And we'll go to Tom. Tom, your thoughts.
Thank you. I'm going to read from a different translation, which happens to have the Greek on the other side of the page. So I want to just bring out one thing here. Socrates says, I only wish, Crito, the people could accomplish the greatest evils, that they might be able to accomplish also the greatest good things. Then all would be well. But now they can do neither of the two, for they are not able to make a man wise or foolish, but they do whatever occurs to them. I think there might be a binary opposition here that Socrates is offering between a majority that can think coherently and therefore lead to something which is either a great evil or a great good, and on the other hand, a majority that is simply random. When he says they do whatever occurs to them, the word there, tukosi, is a word that means by chance. And so I just wonder whether one of the things Socrates might be suggesting is that if you're in a society which is capable of doing good or evil, at least that society has the power to think and coherently form something, where if they're just random, you're really shit out of luck.
I like that interpretation. That's helpful, actually, in focusing on the idea of things happening haphazardly or by chance, I guess, I think is an interesting way to focus on this, because maybe, Dave said that the majority can help to moderate, but maybe the majority can also help to take reason out of the picture and act based on some sort of majority emotion, which is more not based on thought or reason, but just based on, some particular passion of the moment, I think maybe is part of the issue. And maybe when that happens, things are haphazard.
And on the other side, if the society or the majority is able to put together some rationality, whether for good or evil, it suggests the possibility of a dialectic of some kind where, okay, these people are clearly doing something evil, but we can argue with them because they're doing it for some coherent, presumably, reason.
Right. Yeah. And I think we have here the example of Socrates' trial having preceded this. And, the majority opinion there didn't seem to be well reasoned. I think even Crito and Socrates are both admitting that it was a bit of a travesty of justice, but they're reacting differently to the outcomes. So thanks for that. Maybe what we can do now is go and I'll read the next section that I picked out. And again, we can have, if somebody wants to volunteer for either Crito or Socrates for this, the Crito's part is rather longer in this one, or I can do it as well. This is from 45C to 47A. And this is some of the reasons that Crito employs. And I thought this was maybe an example of Crito trying to use reverse psychology on Socrates. I guess he didn't really know what he was up against. Well, why don't I read this then? So Crito starts at 45C. Besides, Socrates, I do not think that what you are doing is just to give up your life when you can save it, and to hasten your fate as your enemies would hasten it, and indeed have hastened it in their wish to destroy you. Moreover, I think you are betraying your sons by going away and leaving them, when you could bring them up and educate them. You thus show no concern for what their fate may be. They will probably have the usual fate of orphans. Either one should not have children, or one should share with them to the end the toil of upbringing and education. You seem to me to choose the easiest path, whereas one should choose the path a good and courageous man would choose, particularly when one claims throughout one's life to care for virtue. I feel ashamed on your behalf, and on behalf of us, your friends, lest all that has happened to you be thought due to cowardice on our part. The fact that your trial came to court when it need not have done so, the handling of the trial itself, and now this absurd ending, which will be thought to have gone beyond our control through some cowardice and unmanliness on our part. Since we did not save you, or you save yourself, when it was possible and could be done if we had been of the slightest use. Consider, Socrates, whether this is not only evil, but shameful, both for you and for us. Take counsel with yourself, or rather, the time for counsel is past and the decision should have been taken, and there is no further opportunity, for this whole business must be ended tonight. If we delay now, then it will no longer be possible. It will be too late. Let me persuade you on every count, Socrates, and do not act otherwise. Socrates responds, My dear Crito, your eagerness is worth much, if it should have some right aim. If not, then the greater your keenness, the more difficult it is to deal with. We must therefore examine whether we should act in this way or not. And not only now, but at all times, I am the kind of man who listens to nothing within me but the argument that on reflection seems best to me. I cannot, now that this fate has come upon me, discard the arguments I used. They seem to me much the same. I value and respect the same principles as before. And if we have no better arguments to bring up at this moment, be sure that I shall not agree with you, not even if the power of the majority were to frighten us with more bogies, as if we were children with threats of incarcerations and executions and confiscation of property. How should we examine this matter most reasonably? Would it be by taking up your first argument about the opinions of men, when it is sound in every case that one should pay attention to some opinions, but not to others? Or was that well spoken before the necessity to die came upon me, but now it is clear that this was said in vain for the sake of argument, that it was in truth play and nonsense? I am eager to examine together with you, Crito, whether this argument will appear in any way different to me in my present circumstances, or whether it remains the same, whether we are to abandon it or to believe it. It was said on every occasion by those who thought they were speaking sensibly, as I have just now been speaking, that one should greatly value some people's opinions, but not others. Does that seem to you a sound statement? You, as far as a human being can tell, are exempt from the likelihood of dying tomorrow, so the present misfortune is not likely to lead you astray. Consider then, do you not think it is a sound statement that one must not value all the opinions of men, but some and not others, nor the opinions of all men, but those of some and not others? What do you say? Is this not well said? So there, Socrates is addressing the opinion of the majority and starting to address Crito's arguments. He will proceed to address more of Crito's arguments in his later discussion or his mock discussion with the laws. But Crito is presenting this idea of shame. Crito knows here that Socrates does not care about his own life. So Crito is trying to use Socrates' friends and his children as means to persuade Socrates that he should flee the city. So knowing that no appeal to Socrates for his own personal safety will work, Crito tries to bring this sense of shame and guilt on Socrates. And Socrates is having really none of it. He's just saying he's sticking by his convictions. This sort of reminded me a little bit of Thomas More and Henry VIII, in that somebody really sticks with their convictions no matter what they're facing. Socrates is just maintaining this kind of consistency of his philosophy and his approach to life. And it's not changing now that he's suffering a dire fate. He's happy to go with what he's believed all of his life. And I think that will maybe carry through to his discussion with the laws in terms of what benefit he's drawn from the city during his life. Is there any thoughts about the arguments that Crito is trying to use here? I mean, I found that argument about Socrates' children particularly poignant. Like, how could a man willingly go to death and leave his children as orphans? I mean, that was a pretty tough blow, I think, that Crito landed on Socrates there. But I think we'll find Socrates later saying that even children are not important when it comes to one's soul. One has to really look after one's soul and not consider things that just exist for a period in time. Is there any other arguments that Crito might have used to persuade Socrates? So he's trying to say, Socrates, leave the city that you loved and spare us your friends, spare us this shame. This was an interesting section near the end. Consider then, do you not think it is a sound statement that one must not value all the opinions of men, but some and not others? So in that case, some is referring to opinions. And then he goes on in the next statement to say, nor the opinions of all men, but those of some and not others. So the some in that case refers to men. So one believes either the opinions or the men who express the opinions. We'll take Darren and then Dave.
Oh, does Dave want to go first? I was going to jump in because no one was going to say anything, but
go ahead.
Okay, I'll go. All right. Yeah, I just noticed. Oh, hang on. Oh, sorry. I got a new message on Zoom. Looks like you're done talking. Oh, hang on. It tells. Okay, that's a new thing. Sorry.
Okay.
It just popped up in front of my screen. It told me to lower my hand because it said it looked like I'm done talking. Anyway, sorry. I've never seen that before. Yeah, it was like a pop up. Anyway.
Okay.
I find this entire dialogue to be actually, this is my second time reading it through, and I read it first time a long time, a few years ago. I actually found this to be very moving dialogue. I actually found it quite emotional to read. Just understanding the situation that Socrates is about to die, and here's one of his best friends coming to save him. And if I was in Crito's shoes, I had a special friend like Socrates, who, as Crito says, you'll never have a friend like this again. Like, why wouldn't you try to save the person? And especially if there's if it's possible to. And I found Crito's pleading, I think that's what it is here, to be like very moving too. So I think that comes through in some of his arguments, that like Crito's sort of desperation to save Socrates. But also I think another thing that I think clearly comes through in what he says, right? He says there's no further opportunity, this business must be ended tonight. So like there's clearly an urgency in the situation. I mean, I think we get the sense like right from the beginning and throughout. And I think that's actually significant. That's a very important thing about this dialogue, and that it happens in such in a condensed period of time and with such a urgent time horizon. Socrates might be executed any time now, when the ship arrives, when the ship returns. And I think it's significant because it's about whether, when times become desperate and when things are urgent, whether we can maintain our personal integrity, basically. Because like what Socrates is saying here, right, in this speech, in his like speech or whatever you call it here, he's saying that, you know, we made all those arguments before, we had so many philosophical discussions, so like at this moment when we're actually tested in life, he asks, was that all just play and nonsense? All those days and years they spent discussing philosophy, that Socrates spent discussing philosophy with all those people, or maybe today's equivalent, discussing philosophy at philosophy meetup groups. Is it all just pointless? Is it just meaningless babble, play and nonsense? Was it all in vain? He says, was it just for the sake of argument? It's just a play thing. And I think we find here that, probably as we long suspected, that for Socrates, this is like a serious business. Yeah, it's about it. Like he takes his thinking very seriously. It's not just a play thing, and it's related to a soul. So if he gives up now, it's like giving up something very important that's maybe more valuable to life, like physical life for Socrates. So anyway, I just thought I'll just tie those things together. I think like the desperation, urgency of situation, and how that actually isn't just incidental. That's actually central to the theme about personal integrity in this dialogue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like the way you pointed that out, and actually it does tie to the opening and that introduction that I read. So initially, Crito says you're going to die tomorrow because the ship is arriving today, and your appointed date of death will be the day after the ship arrives. And Socrates says, no, I saw in a dream it's going to actually be in 2 days. And that means that since there is that day in between, Crito then has the chance to explain to Socrates that he could escape during that intervening day. If the execution had been the next day, then there would be no opportunity to organize this escape. And so, as you say, it's actually, you raised a point that I hadn't thought of before, which is this, that the urgency presents this sense of compulsion, maybe to Crito, and he's trying to pass this sense of compulsion on to Plato, or to Socrates, that time is pressing. Like we need to act now. So if you act quickly, we can do this. But when we act quickly, we don't have time to think. And Socrates is saying, no, I'm sticking to my guns. I'm not going to change my opinion just because there's this urgency on us. But I think you raise a very good point, because when there's urgency, and especially when the majority feel a sense of urgency, then they can be moved perhaps to some conclusions that they wouldn't otherwise take if they had time to reflect on it. I think that's a very good point, a very important point, actually. So thank you for that.
Yeah. Can I just maybe add a quick footnote to what I said? I think, hang on. Sorry, I lost my thoughts. Sorry. I'll let Dave go.
We'll come back to it. Dave, your thoughts?
Yeah. If the law is a good law, like I think the murkiness in this discussion happens because they talk about the opinions of men and whether or not they're good opinions or bad opinions, and whether or not laws are good or bad. I think the clearest point that Socrates makes is, if it's a good law, then if I've broken a good law, I should be punished. I shouldn't be exempt. That to me is a very clear principle that I think, there's no debate really. You think it's a good law, like for instance, if you agree, not allowing parking in a fire zone, I park in a fire zone, I get a ticket, I really should pay the ticket. I agree with that because it's a good law and I did something wrong. So in Socrates' argument, if it's a good law that I broke, then I should be put to death. That's a slightly different argument from the other stuff that he was talking about earlier about some opinions of men, and some are good and some are bad. That's a different sort of an argument. And I think that muddies the water a bit. I think it's like two different parts of argument here. Crito is just arguing from a practical point of view. Look, Socrates, forget all this, principled opinion and action. Your kids are going to suffer. All your friends are going to suffer. So do the practical thing and let us bribe the guards and get you the heck out of Athens, and life will be sweet. And Socrates makes the point that if it's a good law and I broke it, I should suffer. I shouldn't exempt myself from good laws. And I think, to me, that is a real truism, that you know, like it's like these people that turn themselves in, even though they wouldn't have been caught, because they think it's, you know, that they broke a good law, and so therefore they should be punished. They shouldn't have exemptions just because they're able to escape or avoid punishment. So it's a very principled, I think that is a very principled, clear, good idea that Socrates has. The other stuff about the opinions of man, and some are bad, some are good, to me, that it doesn't say much to me. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And I like that presentation, or that depiction of Crito as arguing from a practicality standpoint, and that contrasts quite a lot to what Socrates takes, the more philosophical long-term approach. It's Socrates' approach is not practical to maintaining his life, but that's not what he's concerned about. So
yeah, he's much more, he's an abstract, he takes, he abstracts from the situation to try to come up with a clear principle upon which to act, which is not what most people do.
Yeah, exactly. No, and that's good. I mean, I think let's see what Socrates thinks about the laws. I mean, you use the term good. I'm not sure that he's judging the laws at any point here. I think he's, and we'll see this maybe in the discussion when he gets into the discussion with the laws, that it's more, I think, about something that he's benefited from. And maybe he's not so concerned about the laws themselves being good, but maybe it's the men who apply the laws. And that's the part I mentioned in the introduction that comes out right near the end of the dialogue at 54, around 54C, when he says, just find the sentence, as it is, you depart if you depart after being wronged, not by us, the laws, but by men. So this was his discussion with the laws. So the laws are saying we're not the ones who have delivered this injustice. It's the men who applied the laws who are doing that. So it's an interesting argument. And I really struggled, or not struggle, but really it made me think what Socrates means by the laws. You know, is it the laws at one particular point in time, or is it the laws in general, the laws that have created the whole constitution of the city from which Socrates has benefited? So yeah, I think very good points to raise.
This is very, just a quick little note, this is very Platonic to talk about the laws as though they're kind of handed down, you know, rather, I mean, this is Plato through and through, the idea of ideals, the ideal good, the ideal laws, the ideal guitar. That is Plato through Socrates, which you know, which create, well, you can agree or disagree, like it or not. Personally, I find it unreasonable, but anyway, that's me.
No, thanks. Yeah, I mean, that's a good, you know, laws in the abstract versus laws, you know, the practical laws, the laws that exist now. So yeah, I think it's a question of time, maybe, with the laws that's in play here. So thanks for that. And Darren.
I think I got my thought together. But just a quick thing about the laws here, what you guys were just discussing. I find it's actually a little bit weird personally, because Plato doesn't worship the laws as they are. And we saw that when we read The Statesman last year, and like Plato is a bit of a cultural critic. He doesn't take things for granted. So the fact that we were hypothesizing the laws and in a sort of very extreme way. Remember, this isn't Socrates speaking. He's just sort of pretending to be the laws as if they were a person. And it says some extreme things, like you have to worship and obey, like you have to worship the gods, and as if, you know, it was the highest thing. I don't know, I thought it was a bit weird, and also like not what other dialogues seem to say. You know, Plato's always about asking questions about our laws and so on. And also, it also says some things that I just don't think are even maybe true. Like, apparently the laws are going to accuse Socrates of not trying to persuade them to change. Like, you can either obey or try to persuade. And then like, but Socrates did seem to try to persuade, as far as so I was confused about that. And then another question is, okay, so if you try to persuade, but you fail to persuade, so do you still have to obey then? Anyway, I'm just saying that I think there's a lot of weird stuff going on there. So I'm not ready to say that, you know, I like in so many of these dialogues, what we hear isn't necessarily like Plato's view, so, per se. So I got my own thought. Sorry, coming back to the thought I had was that I guess this relates to what Dave said too, which was actually was helpful to what I was thinking about. So I guess I think this dialogue personally, I think is actually about almost like existential personal thing rather than like a treatise about laws or about anything like very very theoretical. Like what I said before, I think what's at stake in this very urgent situation is Socrates' own soul, and I think also like Crito's soul, which is why Socrates is going to keep reminding Crito. Like they don't even really make arguments here. Like it's just Socrates saying, "Oh, we discussed this and we discussed that. Don't you remember this, Crito? We talked about this." And so I feel like so the urgency for Socrates, if he's not like super concerned about his own physical life, is at least for Crito's life and Crito's soul, because this might be the last time we ever get to talk to his good friend about these issues. So there's sort of like poignancy there. And I think the issue about integrity. So this is the thing I wanted to say, but I was like trying to put my thought together. I think the dialogue is showing what it means to live a philosophical life, to like take this kind of life seriously. And like philosophy, like it could just be like a whole bunch of like word games, right? Like that's what like philosophy could be. But Socrates obviously doesn't do that. And I think throughout these dialogues, he demonstrates what it means to live a philosophical life and take it seriously, to the point that even all the things you discuss, if the conclusion means that, and all the things like as we're going to see later, like the laws are going to say Socrates committed to this and they agreed to that, and he said this, his words matter. That even if in a certain situation it means that you have to die for it, well, that's what it means. And so that's how seriously he takes philosophy, that when we're using a reason, it's about something real. It's not just all, as psychology likes to say today, it's all just rationalization, just it's ad hoc rationalization. Like for Socrates, it's about something real and something objective, and he takes it seriously. He's going to honor his own thinking. It's not just like like as that quote earlier, like it's not just haphazard, whatever we're thinking. I guess this applies to what Dave says too, because like, the theory about, when we should accede to the laws and all that, like that's actually all nice in the abstract. Like I could agree with Dave, and, that's a nice theory. And, Socrates could lay out this theory too. Hypothetically, he could have just laid out the theory. But I feel like there's something just so much more deeper at stake here. Because even if you have the theory, like I could have this political philosophy about it, but am I actually going to live it? When I am personally actually tested, am I actually going to live according to this theory that I was like, happily in a philosophy meeting on a Monday evening, I can be like, oh yeah, this is a nice theory. I think it's totally true and objective. But like when push comes to shove, when I am actually tested in my own life, what was that all just, as they say, play and nonsense? Was that just said in vain? Was that just said for the sake of argument? Or is it actually, are we doing something real in these meetups, for instance? So I just feel like this dialogue is actually, there is theoretical stuff, but I think the significance of it is actually on a much more personal existential level. And we see this through the drama that's unfolding between Socrates and Crito.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like the way that you pointed out that Socrates knows that he's dying in 2 days. So he's not concerned. The urgency isn't for himself, but I think maybe there is some sense of urgency in Socrates for Crito's soul and for philosophy in general, that it should survive Socrates, so that he should encourage people like Crito not to abandon their philosophical principles for what the majority think. And it just occurred to me, actually, as you were speaking, that maybe this is Socrates trying to leave some memory behind about or warning the city itself that if it accedes to the majority, it will make mistakes, such as the mistake that led to Socrates being condemned to death on this trumped up excuse of having corrupted the youth. And so maybe this is Socrates speaking to the future, knowing that he's going, knowing that he won't be around for much longer. He's more concerned about the survival of Crito, about the survival of philosophy, and about the survival of the city. So maybe that's some very interesting points that I think come out from what you just said. So thanks for that. I'll maybe proceed to the next section here, which is this is Socrates and Crito still in discussion. So we haven't got Socrates speaking about the laws yet, but I thought I'd do this reading and then we'll get into Socrates' discussion with the laws, because I think what we're doing here is kind of setting the stage to understand what that discussion is about. And this is from 47a to 48b. And Socrates starts. Darren, did you want to make a interjection there?
Oh yeah, I just thought maybe I could just jump in with a thought I had before we move on to the next part, which is, so regarding this issue of concern for Crito's soul, just one aspect I don't think has anyone's brought up yet, which is that, okay, so Crito's, it's an urgent situation, it's desperate, he's trying to get Socrates to change his mind, so we can maybe understand some of the harshness and some of the arguments that he sort of launches at Socrates. But we also see that in this situation, some of Crito's arguments come back to they redound to his reputation. And I think this must be kind of disappointing for Socrates, because they've had all these conversations about what really actually matters. And, it's not, what other people think of you. Like, it doesn't matter if they're just because they're other people, it matters who it is and so on. And he's talking about, we're going to get a terrible reputation of being cowards and all that if you don't try to escape with us. And I think, some of what's happening here is also Socrates, like, in these last moment, this last opportunity to remind Crito that, what actually matters in life. And I think this might also have something to do with, as we've said, James, in some of our previous discussions about other dialogues, the interlocutor might, with Socrates, is, in all of these dialogues, a specific character, but that specific character might stand in for Athens too. And I think this relates to what you were saying earlier, James, too. So here, in this case, it might have something to do with how maybe the idea of a reputation in other people's eyes was a particular important Athenian value or ancient Greek value, maybe, this idea of honor or whatever. And I think we've seen in many dialogues that we read that, like, Plato and Socrates poke, holes in that and ask, what is this value of this honor? Shouldn't we know what is actually good first? And not worry about, what other people think. We should worry about, we shouldn't think arbitrarily, we shouldn't be totally like subjective in that sense, but we should think, we should question what is actually good with our reason. So anyway, so I just want to bring this aspect of concern for Crito's soul. And he seems to come back to his concern all the time with his reputation all over again. And Socrates must be like, oh no, this is my last chance to correct this.
No, and that's good, actually. In advance of this particular section, I like the way that you brought in the idea of honor there, that maybe the opinion of the majority is one that conveys some sort of sense of honor on people, and maybe that's what the majority drive people to do, to do things that they think will lead to honor. If that's what the city values, is honor. And so maybe, again, this is Socrates trying to save the city and Crito and philosophy at the same time. Let's see what goes on here in this section from 47a to 48b. Socrates starts, he's talking to Crito. One should value the good opinions and not the bad ones. Crito says yes. Socrates says, the good opinions are those of wise men, the bad ones those of foolish men. Of course, says Crito. Come then, what of statements such as this? Should a man professionally engaged in physical training pay attention to the praise and blame and opinion of any man, or to those of one man only, namely a doctor or trainer? Crito says, to those of one only. Socrates says, he should therefore fear the blame and welcome the praise of that one man, and not those of the many? Obviously, responds Crito. Socrates adds, he must then act and exercise, eat and drink in the way the trainer, and the one who knows, thinks right, not all the others? That is so, says Crito. Very well, says Socrates, and if he disobeys the one, disregards his opinion, and praises while valuing those of the many who have no knowledge, will he not suffer harm? Of course, says Crito. What is that harm, Socrates says? Where does it end? And what part of the man who disobeys does it affect? Crito says, obviously the harm is to his body, which it ruins. Socrates says, well said. So with other matters, not to enumerate them all, and certainly with actions just and unjust, shameful and beautiful, good and bad, about which we are now deliberating, should we follow the opinion of the many and fear it, or that of the one, if there is one who has knowledge of these things, and before whom we feel fear and shame more than before all the others? If we do not follow his directions, we shall harm and corrupt that part of ourselves that is improved by just actions and destroyed by unjust actions. Or is there nothing in this? I certainly think there is, Socrates, says Crito. Come now, Socrates responds, if we ruin that which is improved by health and corrupted by disease by not following the opinions of those who know, is life worth living for us when that is ruined? And that is the body, is it not? Yes, says Crito. And is life worth living with a body that is corrupted and in bad condition, Socrates asks? In no way, says Crito. And is life worth living for us with that part of us corrupted that unjust action harms and just action benefits? Or do we think that part of us, whatever it is, that is concerned with justice and injustice, is inferior to the body? Not at all, says Crito. Is it more valuable? Much more, answers Crito. Socrates says, we should not then think so much of what the majority will say about us, but what he will say who understands justice and injustice, the one, that is, and the truth itself. So that in the first place, you were wrong to believe that we should care for the opinion of the many about what is just, beautiful, good, and their opposites. But, someone might say, the many are able to put us to death. Crito says, that too is obvious, Socrates, and someone might well say so. And my admirable friend, Socrates responds, that argument that we have gone through remains, I think, as before. Examine the following statement in turn as to whether it stays the same or not, that the most important thing is not life, but the good life. It stays the same, responds Crito. And that the good life, the beautiful life, and the just life are the same. Does that still hold or not? It does hold, says Crito. Socrates concludes, as we have agreed so far, we must examine next whether it is just for me to try to get out of here when the Athenians have not acquitted me. If it is seen to be just, we will try to do so. If it is not, we will abandon the idea. As for these questions you raise about money, reputation, and upbringing of children, Crito, those considerations in truth belong to those people who easily put men to death and would bring them to life again if they could, without thinking. I mean, the majority of men. I really like that ending sentence there. And I guess maybe this is a reference to the haphazard nature of the majority, is that they, maybe Socrates is implying here that the majority of men just sort of play with people's lives in their haphazard way, putting them to condemning them one moment and praising them another moment. So maybe this ties to that haphazard nature. But also very interesting in this passage, I think, was the reference to it's not the life that matters, it's the good life that matters. And so maybe this is Socrates' answer to all of the arguments that Crito has given, that Socrates isn't concerned about his physical life, he's concerned about his good life. And he keeps referring to the part of the self that's harmed by injustice and benefited by justice. And I think that's a reference to the soul, as you introduced earlier, Darren. So Dave, your thoughts?
He certainly sounds a little holier than thou, the way that's the majority of men, but I, of course, am above that kind of thing. This is Socrates talking. It's, I find he would be an irritating guy, I think, in a lot of ways, to spend a lot of time with. He's right that if the law is good, then these practical considerations should not determine whether or not you run away or you try to not have the law affect you, which is what I said basically last time, that that argument, I think, is a good one that Socrates, it's a very clear argument. It's a good law. Everyone agrees it's a good law. You agree it's a good law. So you should not, or you should be obligated to suffer the consequences if you broke a good law. It's hard to do. And as Socrates suggests, a lot of people would say, well, I just don't want to go to jail, and I'll do whatever it takes not to go to jail. I know it's wrong, but that's the way I am. And Socrates is saying that's not good. You're probably gaining your life, but losing your soul. And again, this idea of soul, I guess we have to suspend our disbelief about souls for the sake of this argument, James. I guess we should be like Plato and assume there is a soul, and so assuming there is a soul, then Socrates' arguments actually make more sense. Yeah, your soul's for eternity, jail sentence is only, a year, or in the case of a death, he's only losing what? He's an old guy at this point, probably 60 or something.
I think he says 70 at the beginning.
Okay, 70, yeah. So he's only got another 10 years. So why take a chance on eternity for 10 years? That's a good argument. Assuming we have souls, I would say that's a very good argument. But the other stuff about other men and the majority of men are muddy-headed is basically what he's saying. And I'm a clear thinker here, and let's try to be clear about this, Crito. Anyway, thanks.
No, thank you. And yeah, I think, I guess he would say the majority of men that convicted him were wrong. And that seems to be generally agreed maybe at this point. But yeah, he's certainly concerned about the soul. And you're right. I mean, Socrates thinks that the soul lasts the motivating force lasts not only for one physical life, but continues to be regenerated. So, and this is presented in a number of Plato's other dialogues. And certainly in this dialogue, he talks about what happens in this life, but then in the next life, in the underworld, he calls it. That's part of the discussion with the laws as well. He says that the laws of the underworld are brothers of the laws of this physical world. So yeah, there's clearly this idea of continuity of life, not just physical life, but life of the soul. And that goes on forever, according to Socrates, I think. So.
But that adds another twist. You're saying that the laws of the underworld or the afterlife are similar to these laws, and yet there is a debate, I think, about whether these laws are actually good. I think there's an inherent subtext about the question of, Socrates admits he's benefited from them, but are they all good laws? And I guess he's suggesting they are good laws, but then they're misapplied. Well, no, that wouldn't. Yeah, see, to me, this is a bit murky. Is it the laws are good and the people who are judging him misinterpreting the laws? Or, yeah, I find the idea that these laws reflect the laws of the afterlife. So that means they must be kind of a universally good laws. And if that is true, then the men have not misjudged Socrates, assuming he broke the law, and they're condemning him because he broke the law. But so this makes it work. Does he agree he broke the law, or does he say he really didn't break the law? And it's just the men are condemning him, but the law, had they followed the law properly, he would not be condemned. Like, what's he saying? Now I'm all confused.
Yeah, no, and you raised a good point. I think that, and again, I think it goes back maybe to what I said earlier, that maybe he's not talking about the laws at this particular time as being either good or bad or any particular value judgment, but I think he's talking about some sort of laws of all time. That reference to the laws of the underworld, he called them the brothers of the laws in the physical world. So somehow they're related, but they're not necessarily the same. And I don't know, Tom, whether you have a better translation of that word brothers. It occurs near the end of the dialogue. It comes up in one of the readings that we have, so maybe we can get to it at that point. But he does say that the laws of the underworld are, in my translation, the brothers of the laws in this world. So somehow maybe that means to me that what happens in this world has an effect, but not necessarily the same effect, a related effect in the underworld. What happens in one realm affects the other realm, and maybe vice versa. So it's something that we should explore, but definitely drawing that into question, I think, is helpful. So thanks for that. We'll go to Darren and then Tom.
I don't know if Tom wants to go first, if he's going to answer your question, or I'm fine if he wants to go, because I've said a lot already. So
we'll take Tom then.
Thank you. I think the question being raised about whether the laws that are condemning Socrates are just or not is a very important point. And I think it's pretty clear, at least from the way Socrates looks at it, that he didn't do anything wrong. He is being unjustly condemned to death. And yet, he seems to be taking the position that what's at stake here is something larger than his own errant judgment. or the errant judgment of the polis. I think one thing that we want to keep in mind with Athens, with Greece in general, I think at this period, is that the polis matters more than any individual citizen. And I think what Socrates might be addressing is that it's at stake that justice itself be affirmed, even ironically, if it's wrong in his particular case.
That's an interesting way of putting it, that there's something larger at stake, I think is maybe the issue. And maybe I wonder if the word laws is really the best translation of this. Is he really talking more about a constitution, like a foundational constitution, as opposed to a particular set of laws that exist at that particular point? There's been this travesty of interpretation of a particular law, but maybe it's his concern is for the constitution as a whole of the city. So that's a question. Maybe when we hear the word laws, we think of rules that govern us at this particular time, but maybe he's thinking more universally about the whole history of Athens and the history of what made it what it was, and what he was present during its time and enjoyed during its time. That was part of his bargain with the city. And as you said, I guess the city was the most important thing. So one was to make a bargain with the city, one had to adhere to that, because if one didn't, then it could cause the collapse of the city. So yeah, interesting points. Thank you. And then we'll go to Darren and then Dave.
Yeah, I thought what Tom just said was very helpful. I'm gonna try to tie in my own thought with some of the things that were just said here. So on the question, Dave's question of whether these are good laws, I think that's a question. I don't know if it's the one that exercises me the most about this dialogue. I feel like where that section comes up later, I think you included some passages later, so we might get to this. Like what stood out for me personally was not so much a question of whether the laws were good or not, but again, Socrates' own agreement with them through not just his actions and throughout his whole life, but things he said and the commitments he's made. It's going to use those words: agreement, commitment, things he said over and over. And to me, that's, again, I feel like that's the theme of this dialogue. It's something at a much more actually personal level. In fact, like the social contract theory almost doesn't I feel like that's not even that interesting for us today, because like it seems like the contract that Socrates made is very literal given what he said and the commitments he made and the agreements he made, and we don't make these literal commitments with societies we're born into these days today. So I feel like the question, again, like it's not so much about what are good laws, but the fact that it's about Socrates' own relation to the laws or the city or the polis. It's showing, I think the dialogue is exhibiting a very a much more practical, or in terms of like, in the sense of like, it's about his actions and an existential question. Because even if the laws were good, I mean, you could be like, you could even say in theory that, okay, if the laws are good, then I won't run away and I'll accept the death penalty if this happens to me. But actually, that's still in theory. Like, you still have to make a choice that when you are actually sentenced to death and you are given the chance to escape, will you actually do it? That to me is like, I guess the crux of it. And okay, yeah. So just, I guess I'll say one more thing and I'll stop. Regarding the larger thing at stake, that seems to be at stake, that might be being hinted at. So the thing that Tom brought up, I have another idea about this. This actually just comes back to what James was saying earlier, that maybe Socrates has a sense of sort of almost cosmic mission. And I would point out that in this dialogue, dreams are again come onto the scene, and he says at the end that this is what the gods want, and he's hearing these voices, the Corybantes or whatever. So maybe what is at stake is not so much, Athens and its laws, which, I'm going to point out that both Socrates and Plato are they're critics of Athens too. They're not like, Athens laws, Athens. They're definitely not that. Okay, let's just put that way. Which is why, and Socrates himself gets accused of corrupting the youth. Okay, so let's just put that to rest. But I think what is larger at stake then might be philosophy itself. If Socrates has this sort of like more relation to the cosmic through dreams, these visions and voices he says he has in all these dialogues. So what's important then, also what's also important, there's this personal integrity, there's Socrates, or there's Crito's soul, but also there's the legacy he's leaving. Like if he runs away, what's this gonna leave for philosophy to think about? He's sort of held up as this like, very wise and virtuous figure, even his own life. Many people thought this. So, and he was heroic in battle and so on. But like, what kind of legacy is it gonna have for philosophy? As James says, maybe part of this is about saving philosophy too. So there's a lot of that's larger at stake than just like, than whether these laws are good or whether or even whether he should save his physical life. There's these larger issues here in the background, at least.
Yeah, and a good point about the credibility. If Socrates were to escape and to negate all of what he said while he was enjoying the benefits of Athens, which he freely chose to stay in, if he were to escape, then he would call into question, I think, very much his own credibility, but also the credibility of the ideas that he spent his life trying to express, or at least the questions that he was asking people and trying to get them to understand. And so that if he were to behave in this selfish manner, then he would be, I guess, condoning individuals taking on their own sense of justice and doing what they think is just if they think that they have been wrong. But, it might be one thing if Socrates thinks that he was wronged, and it might be clear that Socrates was wrong, but in other individuals' cases, it might not be so clear. And an individual might take a position which, is selfishly motivated, but take justice into his own hands, and that would destroy credibility. So I think Socrates is being a real beacon of credibility, I guess, for the long line of thought that he has spent his life building up. So yeah, an interesting thought there. I just highlight this one section too, that part of this reading, we should not then think so much of what the majority will say about us, but what he will say who understands justice and injustice, the one that is, and the truth itself. And so who among us is endowed with the ability to understand justice and injustice and truth itself? I think he's trying to imply that nobody is, and certainly maybe not the majority necessarily. So sometimes maybe the majority will moderate this, but maybe sometimes the majority will get carried away, as maybe happened in Socrates' trial. So,
can I just say one more thing related to what I was saying earlier?
And then we'll take Dave. Yeah.
So what you were just saying just made me think of this. So if he runs away, then it means like all the things he sort of said and argued for decades of his life is like, all those lessons about virtue and what is actually matters in life, what the philosophical life is. And that's basically, it seems like it might all be meaningless. And that would make him maybe a sophist, which is always the thing that's like in the background that Plato's always working against, whether, this contrast that's almost in all the dialogues. And now I see in this one too, this contrast between sophistry and philosophy. Is philosophy just all sophistry? It could that could be the case, but Plato wants to consider that maybe there is something unique about philosophy and what that could be, because sophists make arguments. Sophists are very good at making arguments. They have logic. We see in many dialogues between sophists, they have logic. They can be very convincing, but they don't have actual concern or care for the truth. Like they don't think it matters. And so like words then are just sort of like, they're sort of like clouds. They don't matter. You just try to persuade people, get what you want, get your self-interest, and with words, with persuasion, with rhetoric. And that's it. That's life. That's all there is. So we see this in Protagoras. And I would remind that, so we read this dialogue a few months ago, Protagoras. And in Protagoras, Socrates repeatedly in that dialogue, I almost like imagined him like grabbing him by his shoulders and shaking Protagoras to be like, but what do you really think? Okay, he doesn't actually grab Protagoras, but he does keep asking Protagoras, like, I don't care about what, Protagoras is going to say things like, well, many people argue this, or there is this argument, but like, what does Protagoras personally, Protagoras, the great sophist, what does he personally really think? Socrates keeps probing and asking, okay, that's nice. You have all these arguments. You're great at logic. you can tell me what the majority thinks, what these people think, what this historical figure thinks. But what is it you really think, Protagoras, the sophist? And so, yeah, I just want to, so I just realized that, this contrast between philosophy and sophistry might also be in the background of this dialogue, in that, the question being like, are words just like clouds? It's just nothing. It's just all rhetoric, and that's all there is.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Rhetoric and our self-interest, and that's it.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Yeah, Socrates certainly wouldn't want to be branded a sophist after he departs this life, and he wouldn't want to be branded a hypocrite either. So, and what you said about just words, I think maybe that speaks maybe to that last sentence that Socrates said, as for these questions you raise about money, reputation, and the upbringing of children, Crito, those considerations in truth belong to those people who easily put men to death and would bring them back to life again if they could without thinking. Maybe he's saying there that these people just value words more than they value values and thoughts. And so, it's an interesting point to bring. So thank you for that. And Dave.
Yeah, I find Socrates' criticisms of fellow man kind of muddies the water. I think he's got good arguments, or at least a nice, clear, logical analysis. If the social contract is the most important thing, then even if the laws are not that great, but you've entered into the social contract, and the contract basically says you must follow the laws, then it's pretty irrelevant whether the laws are good or bad. The social contract is the most important thing. But if that's not the case, and the goodness of the laws is really what you're striving, what you're debating, then the social contract isn't as important. But I get the sort of the feeling Socrates kind of flips around a bit, that in one sense, the social contract, the idea that he's benefited, he's lived in Athens, he could have left, he's benefited from these laws. So that's the social contract kind of thing. But on the other hand, he suggests that the law may not, he didn't do anything wrong, but the laws have to be followed. So that's a social contract idea. But then he also talks about his fellow man condemning him when they shouldn't have. So did they follow the law, or did they wrongly apply the law? I'm not sure. Could you answer that for me? Like, was the law actually a good law, and that it was misapplied by his dummy fellow citizens, the way he said, or was the law bad? But the main thing is the social contract. What's the answer? I'm confused.
It's a good question. If I were to give my answer to that, it would be that the law in general said that the youth should not be corrupted. So that was the law. But the men who applied that law misinterpreted it to say that Socrates, through his questioning, corrupted the youth. So if the law that youth should be not corrupted sounds like a good law, I would agree with the law like that. Don't corrupt the youth. But it's a question of then what constitutes corruption, which is for man to determine. And in this case, a jury of Athenians decided, under some sort of majority influence, that Socrates had disobeyed that law, and what Socrates did constituted corruption. And I think now they're maybe second guessing it, but it's too late. He's already been condemned. So that's how I would answer that question. Maybe that's an example of the difference between the principle of the laws and the actual application of the laws. The idea of the laws versus the practicality of it, and the practicality is sometimes confused by men. I don't know.
Well, I think the confusion arises by this term corrupting or corruption. Yeah. It seems to have a pretty broad definition. And Socrates thinks, oh, I wasn't corrupting anyone. I was just trying to clarify their thinking. But his fellow citizens said, yeah, by trying to question things, you were casting aspersions at our basic ideas here in Athens. Yeah. And casting aspersions is the same as, questioning is the same as corrupting. And Socrates, rightly so, I think, would say, well, no, questioning is not corrupting. But, all through the ages, monks living in abbeys all for, 1,000, 2,000 years throughout the Middle Ages and before and after, one of the things that they were not really supposed to question the tracts, the religious tracts that they were studying. They were supposed to accept them. And in fact, in a lot of abbeys, questioning was dealt with by swift blows on the head or the back or whatever, using a cane from the abbot. So this whole idea of questioning as a corruption in a religious tone or in a religious setting seems quite common, and you know, this seems to be what the majority of men dealing with Socrates are thinking, that corruption means questioning. And so again, well, you know, so it's so I don't know, you know, I find these, I'll just give you a quick opinion here. I find historical analysis of philosophy, I like modern philosophy because it's more science-based. A lot of the stuff in the past, you get caught up into the terms corruption, souls, you know, I end up not really having a clear picture of the argument that Socrates is making. I find Plato pretty elusive. Anyway, I guess I shouldn't really bring that in. We're focusing on this discussion. I suppose I should just stick with that and say, I'm not sure, you know, I wish Socrates hadn't said the men here, you know, the majority of men are idiots and they don't see things clearly the way I do. I wish he had just stuck with purely the idea of social contract, law, definition of corruption. That would have been a clear argument, I think.
Yeah, interesting point. And certainly a lot does hinge on the meaning of words, which I think is the beauty, but also the challenge of humanity, is that we all have different senses of meaning, and at different times we have different senses of meaning. And so, you know, maybe when that law was written, corruption meant one particular thing, and then by the time Socrates steps on too many toes and annoys too many people, the word corruption is redefined to mean something else and used as a weapon against Socrates. But I think this is what humanity does through all time. And, you know, I think Plato very rightly points out the importance of meaning. That was actually what we started the season of the podcast with, Plato's Cratylus, which is all about the meaning of words. And I think we discovered in that process that meaning is very fraught with problems. And maybe this is one of the things that Plato is pointing out here, or Socrates is pointing out here, is the question of meaning. What does the laws mean? You know, and what does it mean at any one particular time? So I think it's a good point to raise.
A word means what I think it means, no more, no less.
Yeah,
you
exactly.
know where it's from, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And then it becomes a question of whether the word means what the majority says it means, or whether it means somebody who knows what it means. And maybe that's again this part here that I read, you know, who understands justice and injustice? The one, that is, and the truth itself. So,
well, yeah, but that's not just meanings. I think there he's talking about some ideal justice or injustice. It's not just the definition. I think corruption, like justice and injustice, that's a different question from corruption versus not being corruption. To me, justice and injustice is a Platonic kind of an argument or ideal discussion.
But I think we all go through every day determining whether somebody has done justice or injustice to us in small ways as well as big ways. You know, I think it's we do it to each other, I think, all the time. And so each one of us is a judge of what's just and unjust. And I guess it's a question, and we'll see later on where Socrates has the discussion with the laws, and he says, you know, the laws get upset when one person takes the interpretation into their hands, which is what Socrates is trying to avoid. He's trying to avoid interpreting the laws. He's part of the city, and he is part of the fate of the city, I think. So
he is taking the definition of corruption. He is one person taking it into his own hands. Yeah. So he's being hypocritical.
Well, he hasn't defined. I mean, he might have his own ideas, I think, about what he did, but he's accepting the city's the verdict of the jury. But
then he shouldn't be arguing against it. He should say, corruption is what they say it is because of the social contract that I've agreed to. Therefore, they are smart, and I should die.
Well, let us see what he says when he starts talking with the laws. We'll get to that section very shortly. In fact, maybe after Darren. So, Darren, your thoughts?
Yeah, I just thought I'd respond to some of the things that have been said. Or so regarding accepting the outcome of the laws and Socrates doing this, an outcome of the, I guess, the execution of the laws. So there is a difference though between just accepting the laws, such as accepting the outcome of a vote, which by the way we have one in Toronto today. Who I don't know if we have a new mayor yet. We'll find out soon enough. And versus accepting something as a truth for oneself. This is a distinction that's very common in political philosophy. So Rawls talks about this a lot, that we can agree to a social system where we have things like votes, but it doesn't mean we give up our, it doesn't mean we give up our conscience to it. It means there's different kinds of agreement, and there's sort of different levels of agreement. So I just was that as that I just want to make that distinction and put that out there. We got sorry, excuse me, regarding the definitions of words and all that, words like soul and corruption that Dave doesn't like. This reminds me of our discussions in the Cratylus. So which reminds me, I want to go back because there's Plato is also very concerned about words, their meanings. So we see in the Sophist, right? He tries to be super careful in defining his terms, and he goes through this long process of division to try to be very clear about the meaning of his words. And in the Cratylus, the dialogue on language, a sort of imaginary character there was the I think he was called the supervisor, the one who supervises the the definitions of words and creating words. And there's a lot of interesting things that were said there. So I mean, I would recommend people look at that dialogue if you're concerned about what Plato thinks of the words. And it is certainly, Plato does think that it is very important to get our words very get our words right, but that's also not the task of every dialogue. So if you want a very specific definition of corruption or soul, maybe this is not exactly the right dialogue to look at. So, and then another thing I wanted to respond to was right. So regarding the injustice of the verdict, I think there were also maybe vendettas against Plato or against Socrates. And I also want to point out that I think it was also unjust because I think it should be pointed out that it wasn't, I don't think it was just that Socrates was like irritating or annoying to people. That could be a problem, but I think it went deeper than that. I think people often feel threatened by philosophy, and we see this in many of these dialogues that Plato writes, that, I mean, they're dramas for a reason, and we see personalities come through and people feel threatened by philosophy. We see a lot of characters feel threatened. And in fact, we saw this recently. So we read the symposium recently, and I'm reminded now of Alcibiades in part 3 of the symposium. So people can, go to listen to that discussion if they're curious. But there he says that, so he's very drawn to Socrates' appeal. So he sees Socrates' value. In fact, he seems to love Socrates, and everyone laughs at him because his speech seems to evince that he's still in love with Socrates. But he also hates Socrates. He says that because Socrates makes him feel terrible about himself. It's not just that Socrates is irritating. Socrates also he says that, Alcibiades says that Socrates makes his life feel worthless. It's like his life is trying to get reputation and honor and become an important public figure and politician. He thinks that Socrates makes his whole purpose in life, or his goals in life, worthless. And so that's probably that. I think that's another important reason why Socrates might have been executed, is because not just that he was annoying, but he was a figure that people looked up to, and so his opinions sort of mattered, and to the extent they mattered, it made people feel like their lives were worthless. All the things they thought were important that they wanted to pursue, happiness or power or good reputation in other people's eyes. Socrates keeps pointing out that maybe these things aren't as valuable as you think. Yeah. So again, like this, and I remember during that discussion, we were saying how Alcibiades it probably is an analogy for Athens in general. Yeah, I'll stop there. Yeah.
And certainly, I guess to the extent that Socrates stepped on the toes of the majority, maybe in their perceptions, led to all of this. So yeah, no, it's some good points. So we have just about a half an hour remaining. So I wanted to get into this section where Socrates speaks with the laws, and that starts at, I have this section picked out from 49C to 51A. Again, it's Socrates and Crito start talking, but then Socrates, towards the end of this section, brings in the laws. He starts this mock discussion with the laws. So I'll just read this bit. So Socrates starts saying, well then, if one has done harm, is it right, as the majority say, to do harm in return, or is it not? Crito says, it is never right. Socrates says, doing harm to people is no different from wrongdoing. That is true, says Crito. Socrates says, one should never do wrong in return, nor do any man harm, no matter what he may have done to you. And Crito, see that you do not agree to this contrary to your belief. For I know that only a few people hold this view, or will hold it, and there is no common ground between those who hold this view and those who do not, but they inevitably despise each other's views. So then consider very carefully whether we have this view in common, and whether you agree, and let this be the basis of our deliberation, that neither to do wrong nor to return a wrong is ever correct, nor is doing harm in return for harm done. Or do you disagree, and do not share this view as a basis for discussion? I've held it for a long time and still hold it now, but if you think otherwise, tell me now. If, however, you stick to our former opinion, then listen to the next point. Crito responds, I stick to it and agree with you, so say on. Socrates continues, then I state the next point, or rather I ask you, when one has come to an agreement that is just with someone, should one fulfill it or cheat on it? One should fulfill it, says Crito. See what follows from this. If we leave here without the city's permission, we are harming people whom we should least do harm to. And are we sticking to a just agreement or not? Crito says, I cannot answer your question, Socrates. I do not know. Socrates says, look at it this way. If we were planning to run away from here, or whatever one should call it, the laws and the state came and confronted us and asked, and so this is where the conversation with the law starts. So this is the law speaking, tell me, Socrates, what are you intending to do? Do you not by this action intend to destroy us, the laws, and indeed the whole city, as far as you are concerned? Or do you think it is possible for a city not to be destroyed if the verdicts of its courts have no force, but are nullified and set at naught by private individuals? What shall we answer to this and other such arguments? For many things could be said, especially by an orator on behalf of this law we are destroying, which orders that the judgments of the court shall be carried out. Shall we say in answer, the city wronged me and its decision was not right? Shall we say that or what? Crito says, yes, by Zeus, Socrates, that is our answer. Socrates says, then what if the law said, was that the agreement between us, Socrates, or was it to respect the judgments that the city came to? And if we wondered at their words, they would perhaps add, Socrates, do not consider it what we say, but answer, since you are accustomed to proceed by question and answer. Come now, what accusation do you bring against us in the city, that you should try to destroy us? Did we not first bring you to birth? And was it not through us that your father married your mother and begat you? Tell you, do you find anything to criticize in those of us who are concerned with marriage? And I would say that I do not criticize them. Or in those of us who are concerned with the nurture of babies and the education that you too received? Were those assigned to that subject not right to instruct your father, to educate you in the arts and in physical culture? And I would say that they were right. Very well, they would continue. And after you were born and nurtured and educated, could you, in the first place, deny that you are our offspring and servant, both you and your forefathers? If that is so, do you think that we are on an equal footing as regards the right, and that whatever we do to you it is right for you to do to us? You were not on an equal footing with your father as regards the right, nor with your master if you had one, so as to retaliate for everything they did to you, to revile them if they reviled you, or to beat them if they beat you, and with so many other things. Do you think that you have this right to retaliation against your country and its laws? So that was an interesting section. The laws have some sort of precedence in time over the individual. And what do we think of that? So this is the first introduction where he's talking to the laws. I thought what was interesting in here, there's a couple of things. First of all, when Socrates says, if we were planning to run away from here, or whatever one should call it, that was an interesting thing, whatever one should call it. So here being Athens, but he's saying we could call it something else. What is the meaning of Athens? Maybe that was an interesting section, whatever one should call it here, or whatever one should call it. And, you know, this concern for the destruction of the city, and the city meaning maybe more generally the society that people have agreed to live in together, is one theme definitely in here. And then the point that he makes that, I'm just looking for it. Yeah, he says, or do you think it possible for a city not to be destroyed if the verdicts of its courts have no force but are nullified and set at naught by private individuals? And, maybe this is something that we see happening sometimes today, that a lot of people are unhappy with laws and verdicts, and they take matters into their own hands, and things become quite contentious, I think, as a result. Any thoughts on that? I don't like being political in this podcast, but it made me think of the insurrection at the US Capitol, or those individuals who thought that they had the right to try to overturn the election. And is that an example, maybe without getting into the specifics of the individuals involved or those who are trying to instigate them, is that an example maybe of individuals taking not the specific laws, but the kind of general constitution of the nation, the ideas that allow the nation to govern, into their own hands, and causing all sorts of chaos and mayhem by doing that? So I just thought that example was maybe a recent example of something that maybe Socrates was talking about at that time. So James, your thought?
Yeah, I think he has a good argument there, that he's concerned about his soul, and you could define the soul, at least, if you're still living, intertangled with the city and the culture that raised you to be, for you to become what you are. So yeah, he's right there, that argument that he's born into the city and that he should respect its laws, because those laws were what, everything in that culture and state was what benefited him, made him who he is, allowed him to be a philosopher. And yet, on the other hand, do you believe that, let's say like Nazi Germany, where there's this kind of taken over by a bunch of madmen, the majority has become, turned into this madness of persecution and using the laws, to, condemn people and to death and so forth. That would also be wrong, wouldn't it? So in that sense, there's a kind of, it's a difficult question whether, but of course, if you think of what what Socrates represented, he's concerned with his soul. And if you say the soul is part of his philosophical thoughts and beliefs and integrity as a philosopher, then his soul is living on in these dialogues that we're reading. We would have lost that maybe if he had taken Crito's advice to escape and run away from the city.
Yeah, an interesting example there that you used of Nazi Germany, and that specific laws were promulgated by those animals, the Nazis, to slaughter so many people. And I don't think Socrates would say that it would be right necessarily to follow those laws, but with the laws that they instituted, really laws that went against the foundational laws of the nation, and to the sense that the nation was not like that before these thugs took it over. And then they convinced the majority, because of the circumstances following World War I and the great poverty that Germany felt itself in, that was used as a basis to rile the majority into putting these beasts into power. And then, the slaughter of so many people ensued as a result. So it's a good example. It's a good example of maybe, I'm glad you raised that. It's another recent history example that I think is quite relevant to the discussion. So thank you for that. We'll go to Ernest and Darren and Dave.
I see what Socrates is saying is it doesn't really matter if laws are just or unjust, good or evil, because he was living there for most of the 70 years and he accepted it and he didn't discuss it or contravene against these laws. And all of a sudden this laws goes against him and he will destroy the laws by running away, because anybody who has friends or relatives who has money can buy a guard and escape the laws. So it makes laws invalid no matter what. If you have money, you can trample the laws and it will destroy the city. And that's what his main objective is. Of course, there's besides that, he wants to preserve his soul. Yes, I agree that. So it's 2 points he is trying to make. But most important, then laws are invalid. It's like anarchy. Anybody can break the law and then buy the garden and run away. That's his main point. Yeah.
That's an interesting point, and you called into attention as well that the attempt to buy, or Crito suggesting that Socrates buy his way out of the laws, which may have been particularly offensive to Socrates, to use money as a value that would trump the philosophical value, I guess, is something. Yeah, and that's an interesting point, actually, because of several references to money at the beginning. In fact, when Crito entered the cell right at the beginning of the dialogue, he said that he gave a little something to the guard to allow him in. So yeah, there's this exchange of money, which, you know, we think of money as a value, but it's not a value to the soul. Money is of no use to the soul. It's
exactly. So it points out that rich people will be able to avoid the laws, and poor people have to abide it. It doesn't make sense. Exactly.
Yeah, maybe that's a good example of injustice, is that there's one set of laws that the wealthy can afford, and the rest have to just suffer whatever fate comes their way. So yeah, that's good. Thank you. We'll go to Darren and then Dave.
I actually wanted to respond to what JK said about the soul, but just quickly regarding what Ernest was just talking about. There's an interesting contrast here between the laws and then the people who execute the laws, which is the majority in this case. And I find it interesting that it's implicit here that the relation between these two can be quite different. So in regard to the law, he's talking to the laws as if they were a person. The language is one of like commitment and what Socrates did and actually said. And I think an important part of this is how, in their sort of imaginary conversation, that the law say you had a lot of time to consider and think about these things and to use your reason. And he made a commitment to Athens after this process. Whereas with the majority, this is when he was talking to Crito, the majority is described as using their power to frighten us with bogeys, as if we were children, with threats of incarceration and executions and confiscation of property and so on. Yeah, so I just find this interesting how the relation to the laws seems to be much cooler and happens over maybe a more extended process than with the majority, which uses these tactics, which are as if to treat us as if we were just children, with scaring us and all that. So anyway, that I don't know what larger implication from that there is. So anyway, regarding the soul, yeah, like what JK said about Socrates' soul is living on dialogues we're reading and in this legacy he left. And I actually think that, so I know Dave doesn't like the soul talk, but I actually wonder if this personal aspect of this dialogue could even make sense without an idea of the soul. Because if there was no soul, I don't see why he doesn't just escape with his physical life. Then he has a few more years of physical life. So if there's no soul, it seems like one should just run away. What is all this integrity stuff? Who cares? That's all there is. That's your physical body. Whatever the soul is, it's the part that has this integrity. I don't know what it is. I'm not gonna tell you what it is, but it's a part that has this quality to it, and can be corrupted, and that integrity can be corrupted. And so yeah, I feel some of these very personal aspects of this dialogue and the personal lessons he's trying to convey to Crito actually seems to make sense if only with this idea of the soul. Otherwise, it's just if he was purely materialist, I'm actually imagine him telling Crito, yeah, right, let's get out of here. I'll have a few more physical years to live, and that's it. What is all this integrity bullshit, right? So anyway, I just thought out there about the soul that I can't point to it or tell you what it is, but it's the part that has integrity and has to make these personal choices, and yeah, and maybe has a freedom to make these choices, or I don't know. Anyway, it's hard to say, but there's things sort of pointing at this thing here.
Yeah, and I think maybe it's a question of whether the soul or the motivating force lasts just for one's physical lifetime, in which case maybe you take steps to preserve that physical lifetime as long as you can to preserve the existence of that soul. So because knowing that when you go, your soul will also go and never reappear again. So you want to do the most with your soul while you're living, versus maybe the Platonic Socratic view is that the soul doesn't last just one life. It goes on for a long, long, long time. And so he's not concerned about just what happens in this one life, which is a very short span for the soul. He's concerned about what happens in the next lives. And that will come. I have at the next section right at the end of the dialogue where he talks about the underworld or the next life, which is how they refer to the underworld, I guess, back then. So yeah, it's a good point to raise. Like, how long does the soul last? And I think we know in Socrates' view that the soul lasts for a very long time indeed, much longer than a single lifetime. So, yeah. So Dave.
But even without the soul, his argument here, if we don't follow the laws and we don't do what the judges say, then, basically Athens will fall apart. That's a practical consideration. Regardless of, soul or no soul, what his argument here in the last paragraph is basically saying, if we don't want to destroy Athens, regardless of whether the rules are perfect or good or not so good, maybe they're bad, the thing is, if we don't follow them, Athens will be destroyed. So this is a very practical argument that he's making, that he and other people should abide by what the judges or their fellow citizens decide that the laws state. If I guess he was judged by a jury, although he talks about the judge. Oh no, verdict of his courts. Okay, yeah, so that's court, so it probably was a jury.
Right.
So he's making a practical case here. To me, this is again kind of I wish that everything was a little clearer, but again, I think this is a strong argument because he's being sort of practical. It doesn't rely on souls and goodness, what's good and what's not good, all this Platonic stuff. This is just a very practical look. If we have laws that are not followed, it's anarchy and the city will be destroyed. So I think this is I think he makes two strong points. If you agree with the laws and if you espouse principles, you should follow them. That's a philosopher. As a philosopher, you shouldn't just babble away like a sophist. You should believe in what you say and follow what you say. And the second idea is the idea that in order to have a city that works and a society that works, you got to follow the rules and you have to abide by them. Otherwise, it's anarchy. So those are two good points, I think. The rest of it, good, souls, all the, I don't know what's going on. Thanks.
Yeah, I like the way you made those 2 points. And I think certainly when he says that, if one person were to bring the laws into their own hands, then it could destroy all the laws. Like by doing that, he would give other people license to do that. So I think that's the risk. And then what you said about, being true to your beliefs, I think that's the point that he made to Crito, and that when he said, and Crito, see that you do not agree to this contrary to your belief. So he's reminding Crito that one's beliefs have to have some consistency through time, or else maybe they're not based on reason. So I think that's, and maybe, with thinking about the divided line that I mentioned at the beginning in the Republic, belief is the starting point, but then you go from belief to informed opinion, and then knowledge, and then wisdom. So he's trying to get Crito past that first step of belief, I think. So thanks. Ernest.
I just want to make clear that we know that trial was taking place in 399 BC, and there are 500 Greek citizens were at the trial, and there were two charges against him, not only corrupting the youth, but also introducing new gods. I believe that's the charge. And so it's both charges were voted against. And what was 280 against Socrates, 224 Socrates. So he only needed 30 more votes to be cleared. So that's how we know this is factual numbers. So that's how the case was heard. And that's why he accepted the decision of the citizens of Athens.
That's great. Thank you for that. That's very helpful, that background. Let me just read just in the few minutes that remain the last section, because this is right at the end of the dialogue, and this is a short section, 2 paragraphs really. This is from 54a to 54c, and this is where the laws are speaking to Socrates. So Socrates isn't speaking at all. The laws are speaking to him. So the laws say, you will spend your time. So if Socrates escapes the city, the laws are saying, you will spend your time ingratiating yourself with all men and be at their beck and call. What will you do in Thessaly but feast as if you had gone to a banquet in Thessaly? As for those conversations of yours about justice and the rest of virtue, where will they be? You say that you want to live for the sake of your children, that you may bring them up and educate them. How so? Will you bring them up and educate them by taking them to Thessaly and making strangers of them, that they may enjoy that too? Or not so, but that they will be brought up and educated here while you are alive, though absent? Yeah, yes, your friends will look after them. Will they look after them if you go and live in Thessaly, but not if you go away to the underworld? If those who profess themselves your friends are any good at all, one must assume that they will. Be persuaded by us who have brought you up, Socrates. Do not value either your children or your life or anything else more than goodness, in order that when you arrive in Hades, you may have all this as your defense before the rulers there. If you do this deed, you will not think it better or more just or more pious here, nor will any one of your friends, nor will it be better for you when you arrive yonder. As it is, you depart, if you depart, after being wronged not by us, the laws, but by men. But if you depart after shamefully returning wrong for wrong and mistreatment for mistreatment, after breaking your agreements and commitments with us, after mistreating those you should mistreat least, yourself, your friends, your country, and us, we shall be angry with you, and while you are still alive. And our brothers, the laws of the underworld, will not receive you kindly, knowing that you tried to destroy us as far as you could. Do not let Crito persuade you, rather than us, to do what he says. So that's right near the end of the dialogue. Do not value either your children or your life or anything else more than goodness. So the idea of the good being brought in here right at the end, but the word good has occurred several times throughout this dialogue. So, the idea of not just having a life, here the laws are saying, well, yeah, you could have a life in Thessaly. Maybe you leave your kids behind, maybe you bring them. Either way, your friends will take care of them if they're really your good friends, like if they are any good at all, they say. So it's this idea of living the good life. The good life is not just surviving, it's surviving according to your principles, maybe is what the laws are saying here. And then respecting that sort of agreement or bargain that Socrates freely made to remain in that society and to be part of that society. So I found it was a really interesting kind of way that the laws had of presenting themselves here, that, and Socrates, I think by this point has tried to use this speech with the laws and his own points to counter kind of everything that Crito said at the beginning in terms of the arguments that he tried to apply to get Socrates to try to save his life. So Darren, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, this is sort of great thoughts to end on. Regarding this issue of the good and the good life, I think the sort of philosophical life that Plato and Socrates are recommending, I don't think it's obvious, right? And I think we see this in so many dialogues. It's not like the obvious. In fact, the practical thing to do might often be look very different from the good life that Socrates and Plato are recommending. I think we see this in dialogues like Gorgias or Thrasymachus in the first book of the Republic might be said to be very practical. If he has all the power, then why is justice not whatever he just declares it is? I mean, if he has the ability to do so, and there's a lot of authoritarian and tyrannical figures in the world today who actually do that, and that's practical for them. So the idea of what's practical, I think, is depends on your point of view. And regarding what is the good, then I want to come back to this thing that this quote you brought up several times, James, about the one man who knows if there is such a man or something like that. And so you mentioned it might be nobody, because like nobody knows the good per se, right? Because it's always like in these dialogues, it's always presented as a journey towards it. But I think it could also be pointing towards at least someone who knows the path. The one man might be Socrates, and this dialogue might when he says following that one man, I mean, maybe it's a bit conceited that Socrates might be basically saying to follow himself. but this could also be Plato. This could also be what Plato is putting into Socrates' words and hinting that like in other dialogues, we like including the symposium, like follow this model, like Socrates and what he represents, and maybe not everything about his personality because we're all different, but in the ideals he represents. So, and I just want to tie this in with the ending. We, as you may know, James, I love talking about the ending of his dialogue, so I hope I can fit this in. I know there's hands up. I'll try to make this really quick. Okay, so the ending is kind of bizarre for me. So he says at 54D, Crito, my dear friend, be assured that these are the words I seem to hear as the Chori bands seem to hear the music of their flutes, and the echo of these words resounds in me and makes it impossible for me to hear anything else. As far as my present beliefs go, if you speak in opposition to them, you will speak in vain. However, if you think you can accomplish anything, speak. And Crito says, I have nothing to say. And the last line is, let it be then, Crito, and let us act in this way, since this is the way that God is leading us. So I find it very interesting, these spiritual aspects come in, like dream, like and of course, like the beginning of the dialogue starts with a dream, Socrates' dream about why he must stay, and he says there that he thinks it's clear enough. And if the dream is, if he accepts what the dream says, it's basically as he does in many other dialogues, then there's almost like nothing else to say, like all the argument is sort of it's like, so what is, and he even and Socrates himself even sort of comes out with this view here where he says he can't hear anything else, and if Crito tries to challenge him, he's going to be speaking in vain. So I find this really interesting. So I'll wrap this up. So I just want to tie this in with actually this reminded me of something from the Ion. So that was about how Ion was he's a rhapsode. He's like possessed by divine, he has a divine gift and he doesn't actually have any knowledge. And we were saying how that might actually apply to philosophy. So I think it's really interesting here that in this dialogue so I feel like Socrates might be sort of getting a message from the gods, and then through these dreams and visions he has, and then he's passing this kind of the inspiration he gets, as we saw in the Ion, the thing that gets passed on like a chain of magnets is the sort of inspiration, the way one touches the soul of another person. And so he's sort of passing this on to Crito, and through these dialogues, of course, to the rest of us, to posterity. Yeah, so I feel like maybe the one man that is coming out is about Socrates and his connection with the spiritual, and how what he's passing on is this gift of philosophy. And it's actually about, so it would be actually about, the dialogue's actually about maybe the hope of finding Athens on this other basis, because then compared to whatever was happening at the time, which was not good in Athens.
Yeah, interesting. And yeah, too, that section, he doesn't say the one man, he says who understands justice and injustice, the one, that is, and the truth itself. And I'm wondering whether that's maybe a reference to the universal soul, because in the Philebus, he says the universe itself has a soul, and which I see, because if I have a soul, do I have anything more that the universe doesn't have? It's hard for me to, so I think that, but maybe when he says the one, it's more this connection to the universal soul. So that was just a thought that occurred there. But yeah, no, it's an interesting point for sure. So we're running out of time, unfortunately, but we'll take Tom and Ernest and Dave, and then I think that's all the time that we will have for this episode. It's been really great, and certainly, Darren, what you said, I meant to mention, the symposium where Socrates was presented with these kind of unusual supernatural powers, and so there's clearly some connection, I think, that Plato is trying to make here between Socrates and some higher level of existence, I think so. So we'll go to Tom, Ernest, and then Dave.
Okay, these are sort of just a couple of random thoughts, but when you mentioned the symposium, I was just thinking about how Socrates at one point here in this dialogue talks about how silly he would look, comical, if he put on some old cloak and escaped, like some thief in the night. And it's almost like it's just not his genre, you can't ever imagine Socrates doing that. And yet you could imagine Alcibiades doing that. And so it's interesting that Alcibiades, in his tribute to Socrates, in a sense, is the opposite, is the polar opposite of Socrates. The other thing I just wanted to say is there's a line there at the very end, that last passage, where he talks about the good, or it's translated in your translation as the good, but in the Greek it's dikaiou, which just means observant of custom. It's related to the root of dike, which is justice, but it's not the good in some capital letter way. And I think it's kind of important that we get the feel for the language that was being used by Plato, rather than, expand it to some universal that takes on a life of its own. And then you had asked about the word for brothers, and indeed it is adelphos, which is brother. So there's a whole genealogy or a family metaphor, particularly towards the end, where the laws themselves say, Socrates, I'm reading my translation here, be guided by us who tended your infancy. And the word tended there is the word for nurturing, as if the laws were, in a sense, the mother. So the suggestion may be that when the laws tend your infancy, it is the infancy of you, if you want to call it your soul, as opposed to just your literal body.
That's great. Yeah, that's a really powerful statement that you made, the family metaphor. I hadn't thought about that, but that comes out through this entire section, the birth, the marriage, the nurturing, the brothers. Yeah, that's really powerful. And thank you for that translation of dikaiou, which does seem to mean something a little bit less maybe than the universal good. I'm thinking of the Republic, the form of the good is that which gives truth to the things known and the power to know to the knowers. So maybe that's not what he's talking about here. It's more like a civic good, maybe something like that. Yeah.
Duty. Yeah.
Duty. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, thank you. I think that's important. And this is the problem. I have adopted the Hackett translation as the standard for this series, but it's key to note that there are different ways of seeing things. So that's great. Thank you. We'll go to Ernest, and then we'll wrap it up with Dave.
We have to remember a political situation in 399 BC, because it's very different than we experience now. In 403, there was a dictatorship of 30 oligarchs, and some of them were former students of Socrates. And even so, they did not follow Socrates' philosophy, but people in Greece, because they knew they were former students, they blamed Socrates for their performance, because they killed more than 1,500 Athenians during their dictatorship. So they blamed Socrates for that, even so he was against oligarchs. So he knew they retaliated against him. It wasn't, they didn't have clear minds. They had the impression that he corrupted the youth, and so he knew it was not correct judgment. But what's most important about this Crito document is that he didn't want to retaliate. He didn't want to pay back. That's message. And so when we were talking 2 weeks ago with Darren, because they executed him, he became like a martyr and became more famous. He became more famous because he didn't want to retaliate. That's my personal opinion. Thank you.
No, thank you. And that's a really good use of that understanding of the retaliation and the context of Socrates' students, I guess, blaming the teacher. Don't blame the teacher. So yes, and don't retaliate. And imagine what would have happened if Socrates had fled jail. Would we be sitting here today talking about Socrates and his wisdom? Yeah, I think that would be a very different discussion. So yeah, so thank you for that. And Dave, take us into a conclusion.
Well, I was going to just say one thing, Ernest, that's really interesting information. So I didn't know that some of his students,
Yes, there are
they
documents.
started an insurrection kind of thing. So they formed a dictatorship. They killed a bunch of people, and then they were students of Socrates. Is that right, Ernest?
Yes.
Yeah.
Wow.
Wow. So no wonder.
There's also Alcibiades, who was Socrates' student in a way. They're extremely close, and then Alcibiades ends up betraying Athens. He turns over to Sparta's side, so that was also very bad.
Yeah, so I can understand the citizens of Athens not being too pleased with Socrates. He wasn't only questioning; he was also creating these youth who were rebelling and killing and all the rest of it. So that casts a different light on this whole discussion. My only point at the end here that I was going to say before Ernest mentioned this, the fact that these students using Socrates as their teacher, this is what they did. I can understand people being pretty mad at Socrates. Anyway, Socrates has it's an interesting, he uses practical arguments as well. Like he's saying, I won't look good if I run off to Thessaly and, then everyone will look bad. That's kind of a practical consideration. I mean, if he was really just worried about his soul and doing the right thing, why does he need to bring in, my kids will look down on me. I mean, people will look down on me because I'll have gone to Thessaly and I'll be like a guy who went there for a feast, and my kids will look down on me and everyone will look down on me. To me, I think it would be much clearer if the main focus of his argument was, look, it's a simple argument. I have to do what's right for my soul because that's eternal. And I got to do the good thing, or I got to do the right thing. And the right thing is to follow good laws. And regardless of whether I think that actually now I'm confused. I'm confusing myself because he's saying that the law shouldn't have applied to him. So where does that leave me? Sorry, James. I was going to have the last word, and my last word is there's kind of a lot of vague muddiness in this whole discussion.
Well, and that's not abnormal for Plato to end that way and leave the rest of us that way. So I think you perfectly demonstrated what Plato tried to do, was to leave us in aporia and wondering as to.
Sorry.
No, that's perfectly fine. It's perfectly fine. I think that's great, actually, that we end that way and understand that there's many different ways maybe of seeing what he's talking about, but maybe at the end of the day, it's about having strength of conviction and arriving at those convictions through a process of knowledge and thinking again about that divided line of knowledge from the Republic. And once you've reached that stage, you can't revert, and you can't do things that disturb that what you've achieved. And so I think that's maybe what he's trying to say. And clearly there is somebody here who has strength of his conviction. And I think that's maybe he's trying to build a society of people who have similar strengths of conviction and leave that as his legacy, to avoid further, kind of mob rule situations that led to his own conviction, perhaps. And others, as Ernest told us, 1,500 people died because of the 30 tyrants who ran Athens for a while. So maybe it's to avoid situations like that, not just in little cities like Athens, but maybe in big modern nations too. So so I think there's lots that we can get from this, and I think it's really interesting to end kind of at Socrates' ending as well, and see where we can pick it up next season in Plato's Pod. We'll take a break for the summer and resume our group discussions in the fall. I will start with Timaeus in the fall. I want to do that again. We started Plato's Pod in season 1 a few years back with the Timaeus, and I have discovered a lot more in the process of doing these, 40 episodes or so. And I'd like to get back to the Timaeus and start with that. And then I keep promising that we'll get to the laws, the dialogue, the laws, which I haven't read myself. So that's my summer task, to read that. And we'll see if we can tackle that next season as well. But in the meantime, I do want to hold some discussions over the summer. I've met some interesting people, and I think what we can do is maybe talk about the connections of Plato's philosophy and some of the things that Plato says to things that are happening in the modern world today, particularly with technology. And the first discussion I wanted to have was relating what Plato says about writing in the Phaedrus to the new technology ChatGPT. And so we'll have that discussion shortly. So stay tuned for that announcement. So I want to thank everybody for being here today and for a great discussion, because as always, we learn new things coming out, and certainly there's a number of really interesting things that were said, angles that I hadn't thought about before. And so I think I've taken away a fair bit from this episode. And so I'll be really interested to re-listen to it when I get it posted in a few weeks. And I wanted to thank everybody for being online. And we hope that you return for season 4 of Plato's Pod in the fall. And in the meantime, I will end the recording and invite anybody who wishes to stay online for a casual half-hour unrecorded discussion. You're more than welcome to. And otherwise, I shall wish everybody a great summer. So thank you. You're welcome. Yes, thank you. It's been fun.